be splitting my time with my colleague from Barrie, Springwater, Oromadonte. Madam Speaker, I'm proud to rise on behalf of my constituents in the common sense riding of Renfrew-Nipissing Pembroke. After 8 years of this NDP-Liberal government, Canadians are hurting. They're hurting because of bad policies.
For a second, I want to remind members if they want to have conversations to please take them out. The honourable member for Renfrew-Nipissing Pembroke.
Common sense Conservatives have a real plan to turn that hurt into hope. It starts with axing the carbon tax that's pushing up the cost of everything. Canadians understand that when a government has an official policy to increase the cost of energy, it increases the cost of everything that requires energy, which is everything. Yet this socialist coalition thinks Canadians are stupid. They think all they need to do is slap a new label on their carbon tax and Canadians will just forgive them for increasing the cost of living. Unfortunately, they're not the only ones who think Canadians can be fooled. The far-left media allies are already hard at work rebranding the carbon tax. It's no longer a carbon tax. Now they call it a carbon price. How long before the CBC starts to rebrand income taxes as a price on earnings? They can rebrand GST as a price on shopping. They can call it whatever they want, but Canadians know that a tax is a tax is a tax. It doesn't matter how much the Liberals burn to keep their gaslights burning bright. The truth outshines it all. The truth is their carbon tax is going up in April. And so long as these proud socialists hold on to power, it'll go up year after year after year. It'll keep going up until they've redistributed every last dollar from hardworking Canadians in small towns without transit and giving it to wealthy urban elite, like the finance minister who brags about how easy it is for her to get around without a car. Of course, most Canadians would find it a lot easier with a personal chauffeur, a six-figure salary, and a taxpayer-funded luxury SUV. But what about Canadians like Edmund? Edmund lives on a fixed income. His after-tax income is $20,000. He just received his climate bribe for this fiscal quarter. He also received his natural gas bill for December. The carbon tax on that bill was $72.36. That means he paid $9.41 in HST on the carbon tax. That's just 1 month of winter. 1 month eats up half the quarterly rebate, and that's before Edmund has driven a single kilometre. I'd seek unanimous consent to table his tax statement and gas bills, but I already know these Liberals are too cowardly to face the truth. They would prefer to stay in their nostalgia-infused fever dream where everything is awesome. They desperately want to take Canada back to the 1960s where the CBC was popular, the UN was relevant, and Canadians loved a Prime Minister named Trudeau. They really believe they can control the weather with a tax. Just wave their Liberal wand and say, zap, you're frozen. Only a Liberal could summon the level of arrogance required to believe that if they just tax Canadians hard enough, it'll stop flooding. The carbon tax is about punishing the types of Canadians these Liberals call unacceptable and rewarding the ones who vote for them. It's a tax plan, not an environmental plan. The fact is, it's being generous to even call it a plan. Their agenda is a little more than a string of slogans like 30 by 30 or net zero. Now they've gone on an all-expensive, dirty electric batteries, just as the oil and gas industry is discovering vast reserves of clean hydrogen. That's why they're adopting Soviet-style car sales mandates. The only way their battery subsidies won't bankrupt us is if they force people to buy cars that don't work in the cold weather. And before any of my colleagues jump up and shout about what all those electric cars in Norway are doing, I would remind them that the average temperature in January in Ottawa is 3 times colder than Oslo. Even their net zero promise is a fantasy. The only way to reach net zero is with direct carbon capture, but it takes a lot of energy to remove carbon dioxide molecules when they only make up 0.04% of the atmosphere. Yet these proud socialists oppose cheap electricity. Many of these radical environmentalists even oppose carbon capture. They claim it's a way of keeping using oil and gas. But if all the emissions are captured, why would they still oppose it? Unless this was never about reducing emissions in the most economically sensible way. It's about reducing capitalism and increasing the size and scope of the state. Madam Speaker, this has never been about reducing emissions. Last month, I reached out to the Ministers of Agriculture and the Environment. I asked if they could provide technical experts to come and explain the government's proposed protocol to reduce enteric emissions from beef cattle to farmers in my riding. After watching this train wreck of a government mishandle the communications about reducing nitrogen emissions on farms, I wanted to make sure my constituents knew exactly what the government was proposing. I naively thought this government would jump at the chance to prevent misinformation or promote their protocol. Instead, both offices took a pass on the offer. Considering the massive farm protests in Europe, a competent government would have jumped at the chance to engage with farmers. So it was up to me to explain to farmers what this socialist coalition government was proposing. Reducing enteric emissions is bureaucratic language for reducing cow burps. The proposal is that farmers could undertake measures to reducing methane emitted from belching beef cattle. In return, they'd receive offset credits for every ton of methane they reduce from a set baseline. Several farmers in my riding are pioneers in the field of capturing emissions. I wanted to ensure they'd earn the credits for the innovations they're already undertaking. Farmers like the Clazy brothers, who built Canada's first biodigester to turn manure into electricity that they could sell back into the grid. Farmers like Don Russell, whose patented technology eliminates methane from manure. As a member of Parliament for these leading-edge farmers, I wanted to make sure they knew what was coming. While they had many questions, everything always circled back to the bottom line. How much will it cost? How much will they earn? Basic questions everyone operating a business will ask. Unfortunately, the government doesn't have those answers, and not just because they couldn't be bothered to drive up to the Ottawa Valley. The government doesn't have the answer because it doesn't know. They even admit it on their website. Here's what the government says about the price of carbon offset credit. Quote, "The price of offset credits is primarily influenced by supply and demand. If there are many offset credits available with little demand, prices will be low. If there are few offset credits available and a large demand, prices will be higher." End quote. There it is, in digital black and white. The offset credit is the real carbon price, a price that emerges from the intersection of supply and demand. A tax is set by government decree. The carbon tax is not a price on pollution. It's a tax on energy. It's a tax on mobility. It's a tax on life. The government knows what the tax on carbon is, and Canadians know the tax on carbon is going up April 1st. That's why Conservatives are calling on this government to cancel the tax hike. Canadians know we are going to axe the tax, just like Canadians know that we'll build more homes, fix the budget, and stop the crime. The longer this tired, flailing NDP-Liberal socialist coalition ignores the will of Canadians, the bigger the reckoning will be. To increase the tax when everyone knows it's not long for this world is to rub salt in the wounds of high inflation. No amount of rebranding, gaslighting, or fear-mongering will work. It's time for them to listen to Canadians struggling with the cost of living, fueled by reckless Liberal spending. It's time for them to stop punishing Canadians for heating their homes. It's time for common sense.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I would ask for the member to provide some comment as to the Conservative members, including herself, often talk about the impact of the carbon tax, how it's increasing inflation, and they try to give this false impression that we're talking like 4 or 5 or even higher in terms of percentages. And yet I want to quote, if I can, Madam Speaker, the Bank of Canada. And this comes from the governor. And I quote, the contribution that is making to inflation 1 year to the next is relatively small. If you want me to put a number on it, it's in the range of 0.15%. So it's quite small. End of quote. Interesting, from Statistics Canada suggests carbon tax increases the average cost of food by about 0.33%. Relative to what they would be in the absence of the carbon tax. Can she explain to why it is that the Conservative Party of Canada today continues to want to mislead Canadians on such an important issue of inflation?
For Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I will say that getting rid of the carbon tax will decrease inflation immediately by 20%. Now, let me give a real-life example of what their carbon tax is doing. It takes energy to cut the trees that are...
I'm not sure what's going on here, but there seems to be more than a couple of people wanting to chime in on this response or make comments. I would just ask them to please hold off. The honourable for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke has the floor.
Okay, let's talk about how the carbon tax is exacerbating one of the most critical pieces of Canadian life right now, our housing crisis. So to cut the lumber, you need a machine to take down the trees. That machine takes energy. Then you need a machine to drag those logs out of the forest. And then you need another picker to pick them up and put them on the truck and that takes energy. And then the truck has to go to the sawmill, and that takes energy and carbon tax on the fuel for the truck. And then it gets to the sawmill and it gets taken off, and then the people who work at the lumber mill have to saw those logs so that they can be in the right shape to make homes. Well, that sawing takes energy and it increases, there's a tax on that. Finally, it gets shipped to the lumber yard, and the lumber yard brings it to the job site, and that costs carbon tax. And all those taxes at each step along the way is one of the reasons their carbon tax is...
Okay. I have to allow for other questions. The honourable member, l'honorable député de Mirabel.
The honourable member for Mirabel. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. It's always very interesting. So she feels that a carbon tax is not a price on pollution. When I go to the grocery store and buy oranges, I get a resource, oranges, and I pay the price. When I buy paper, that's a resource, and you pay a price to purchase that. And in other provinces, except Quebec, when I use a resource that involves CO2.
I just want to remind members that if they want to have cross conversations, to please take it outside. I'm sure that when they are up standing and answering questions or delivering their speeches, they don't appreciate when other people are actually interrupting them. So I would ask all members to please be respectful.
The honourable member for Mirabel. As I was saying, Madam Speaker, simply, when you go to the store and you buy oranges or paper or any resource, you pay a price for that. There's an amount. And when there's pollution, there's a tax. Well, there's a price for that pollution. My colleague seems to think that that's not a price on pollution. So I just simply like a point of clarification. What is her definition of a price?
Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
Madam Speaker, well, I explained that in the supply and demand. But just because a carbon tax is not itemized on your grocery bill doesn't mean it's not there. It's insidious. It's hidden. And talk about groceries. They want to get rid of all one-use plastics. Now, how are we going to get our fresh oranges that the member just talked about? You have to put them in plastic to protect them. If you go to Florida and you pick them up, it's in the plastic netting. But what's more, a study came out today, and to get the value and the benefit of any reduction in use of petroleum products out of a reusable grocery bag, you have to use that bag 710 times. You get more uses out of a plastic grocery bag that you can line your waste paper basket with.
I'll take a brief question from the honourable member for Elmwood Transcona. Oh, Edmonton Strathcona, sorry.
We are very close, and unfortunately we sit side by side, so it makes it harder. I'd like to thank my colleague for her intervention today. I want to start with the fact that she started her intervention talking about the socialist coalition, which makes me think she doesn't understand what socialism or a coalition is. But I did want to say that from my perspective, what I see is both the Liberals and the Conservatives supporting big oil time and time again. And so I thought of a few other names. We have the corporate coalition, the corrupt coalition, the co-opted by big oil corporation, which in fact is CBC. So we could use CBC as an acronym. So what I want to know is, why does this member always side with big oil and never side with the people in Canada that expect our oil and gas companies to pay their fair share?
A brief answer from the honourable member for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Perhaps the member doesn't realize I'm from Ontario, but what I do support is the ability for my constituents and all Canadians to live a good life, to have a house to live in, to have food to eat, and to have the hope for a future and a peaceful retirement where they don't have to worry about money when they go to sleep at night.